The title of this panel is Global Case Studies, Indonesia, Gambia, and Afghanistan. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, we will not be discussing Gambia because Abdullah Jaban could not join us. And again, our thoughts are with him. So we actually have 3 presenters, and we will end the session 20 minutes earlier because we have 1 fewer speaker, and we'll use those 20 minutes for an open discussion to, I guess, continue our conversation. And then we'll have closing remarks at the end. So we have 3 presenters. The first presenter is Ibu Karyanti from University of Muhammadiyah Palangka Raya. And Ibu Karyanti is currently affiliated with Muhammadiyah University Palangka Raya. She holds a bachelor's degree from the same university in guidance and counseling studies. She also holds a master's degree in guidance and counseling studies from State University of Malang. And the title of her presentation is The Role of Women in Forest Conservation, the Case of Ibu Siti Maimunah of the Muhammadiyah. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ibu Karyanti.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Selamat malam. Adil Katalino, Bacuramin Kasulaga, Basengat Kajibata. This typical hello in Dayak, of Dayak. My name is Karyanti. I am from Indonesia, Central Kalimantan. I'm representation or team Mrs. Lilik Kholisotin. I'm share presentation. This is presentation. Title presentation: The Role of Women of Forest Conservation by Muhammadiyah Perspective. My team, Lilik Kholisotin, and my okay, introduction. Women involvement in forest conservation is an important topic in the change and development of gender issue. Discrimination against women tend to be influenced by culture factor, with some the men are physical strong, more potential and more productive. Women have the same potential as men to be directly involved in forest conservation, show that the gender bias and the management of living nature resource will change over time. The potential and knowledge a person is not seen from a gender perspective. Religion, Islam, especially the Muhammadiyah organization, view gender equality as an issue that must be rectified. Kiai Haji Ahmad Dahlan, as the founder of the Muhammadiyah organization, together with Nyai Ahmad Dahlan, are trying to eliminate discrimination against women. Kiai Haji Ahmad Dahlan believed that the world will not progress perfectly if women are not given the opportunity to develop the higher potential. Okay, the research method uses qualitative method with ethnographic papers. The subject is the study with a woman who had a role in carrying out educational forest conservation in Muhammadiyah. The instrument used in the study were non-participatory observation, in-depth interview, and documentation. The data analysis used in the study is thematic analysis, technique, the describe Muhammadiyah perspective on the role of Mrs. Siti Maimunah as a woman involved in forest conservation at the Muhammadiyah University of Palangka Raya. The result, the role of Mrs. Siti Maimunah as woman involved in the management and participation of the education forest at the Muhammadiyah University of Palangka Raya. Mrs. Siti Maimunah is active in processing the rock and the educational forest and has a broad insight into forest conservation. So she can make discussion about the management and participation of educational forests. The work of Mrs. Siti Maimunah in advancing, developing, and pioneering activities in the educational forest open opportunities for gain research to turn educational forests into research laboratories and success introduce educational forests the several countries. The educational forest managed by Mrs. Siti Maimunah is a special forest area because it's the deepest and rare flora and fauna. The effect made by Mrs. Siti Maimunah to spread to get the educational forests are received support and abstract from parties and with an eye-leading attitude and always showing positive behavior. Many of the award received by Mrs. Siti Maimunah. Discussion and conclusion. Muhammadiyah is as an organization that high value gender equality, few female figure such as Mrs. Siti Maimunah as the people of female figure of the present area. The attitude of Mrs. Siti Maimunah is line with the province of the structure given by Kiai Haji Ahmad Dahlan to women normally. First, with a Saiker had full her the eyes and Islamic woman according to her talent and ability. Does not one praises and does not take a step back because she is critical. Full conservation, full and compassion that cry must the knowledge the not make a cause they are not considered violated by God just to acquire to assign to him. Discrimination to defend the sanctity of Islam and maintaining brotherhood and any of fellow work and challenges. Mrs. Siti Maimunah in an Indonesia woman who precious for the advancement of the Muhammadiyah organization in Central Kalimantan is a female figure who can be used and role model for the young generation, especially women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ibu Karyanti. And as I said before, we will save the questions for the end of the panel. So we now turn to the next presenter, and that is Professor Shah Mahmoud Hanifi. So actually the next two presentations are on Afghanistan. And so we're delighted to have with us Shah Mahmoud Hanifi, who is a professor of history at James Madison University in Virginia, where he teaches courses on the Middle East and South Asia. Professor Hanifi's research and publications have addressed subjects including colonial political economy, the Pashto language, photography, cartography, animal and environmental studies, and Orientalism in Afghanistan. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Hanifi.
Thank you very much, Professor Khalil, and I'd like to express my thanks not only to you, but Professor Chandra, Mary, all the administrators and units at MSU who make the Muslim Studies program go. It's a real pleasure to participate in this longstanding conference. It's a special privilege to share the stage with my father. And I'll try to share my screen if I can, please. And what my intent here is to give you a long-term view of water in Afghanistan, a kind of longue durée approach, maybe 5,000 years of water history in 15 minutes. So I should say at the beginning that I'm a recent migrant to environmental studies. I was a traditional historian working on things like political economy, but got interested in animals, particularly camels. And through a study of animals, I became truly interested in the environmental history of Afghanistan, which I'm now trying to organize a book that will have chapters dealing with water, forests, animals, and food. So I am looking forward to the publication associated, if we get that off the ground, to kind of get a rough draft of the water component of that book. So I'll be moving through a lot of images and a lot of time. I hope to make a couple of connections to some papers yesterday. Natana DeLong-Bass's paper, of course, dealing with water. Dr. Van Wieren's discussion of agriculture, Jonathan Brockup's climate change, I guess will all possible connections for discussions to pursue in that way. I do want to mention that I'm very proud to say I have a lineage to MSU. My father was sent to MSU in 1956, where he met my mother, a Lebanese Arab Michigan. So I have a Spartan lineage, but like Muhammad, I went to the University of Michigan, so I guess we have both blue and green blood coursing through our veins somehow. In any event, what I'm going to focus on here are rivers, and primarily the Indus River, the Oxus River, and the Helmand River, none of which are visible here, but I do want to note it's impossible to separate rivers from mountains, from forests, from people, from animals. And what is most important initially to recognize about Afghanistan is that it draws upon the cultures and the technologies and the civilizational resources of both Iran and India. And I want to offer what may be a hypothesis, at least for the ancient period, regarding that interstitial relationship. And that is, it appears at first glance, at least, that Afghanistan has taken a deep ancient history of overground water storage, tanks, reservoirs, cisterns from South Asia, and underground water movement through underground channels we'll discuss from Iran. And this evidence comes from both ancient textual history, the Avesta, associated with Zoroastrianism, which becomes the state religion of Iran for a number of centuries. And on the one hand, and then the Rig Veda and other Sanskrit texts like the Mahabharata for South Asia on the other hand. Additionally, there's a lot of archaeological evidence that comes to bear on the ancient period. And we'll talk about that in just a second. What's important about Afghanistan's rivers is that they are multiple and complex and are, in a sense, reducible to 5 different river basins. each contributing to a very diverse ecological setting in Afghanistan. It's most important to note that the Kabul River is a part of the Indus River Basin, which brings to eastern Afghanistan the monsoon effect. And it's very important to recognize that ecological framework. So beginning from South Asia, we can say that Afghanistan's rivers come onto the historical map through the Indus Valley civilization from about 2500 to 1900 BC. And subsequently, with Sanskrit texts, we also get a good deal of cultural attention to rivers in Afghanistan. And I'll just leave that statement to stand on its own for a while. Turning to Iran, what we have is the contribution of an underground irrigation system, the Qanat system, that has had a significant effect on Afghanistan's water supply in so many different ways. And what's important about the Qanat or Karez system is that it was developed in Iran and really exported globally, particularly through the Islamic centuries, indeed to China and the Americas. So this is a very significant hydraulic technology for Afghanistan that's very labor intensive. These underground canals are multiple miles long. Some are extremely large, others quite small. They require a lot of communal organization to stay clean and kind of dredged. From the air, they look particularly impressive for their scope and perhaps a satellite view gives us a sense. This is the alluvial fan in northern Afghanistan near the Oxus River that really does highlight how the Karez system has driven agricultural production in Afghanistan for millennia. And I would like to just reference that in broad measure, we have between 5,000 and 10,000 Karez network channels in the Helmand province alone in Afghanistan. These are under great threat by a number of reasons. First, wells, but also warfare. And we'll get to that subsequently here. I'd like to skip to the imperial era now and sort of moving quickly through the Islamic period. I would like to just highlight that Islam gets to Afghanistan in many ways around 1,000 years ago. And the minaret of Jam here is a marker of Islam's presence in Afghanistan. And I would like to draw attention to the role of basically water and architecture in medieval and early modern Islamic urban settings primarily that we don't have time to discuss on the one hand, as well as the artistic attention to water. Here we have a fountain in a court setting from the Shahnameh. And so what we have is a good deal of artistic and architectural developments around water in the early modern and medieval periods of Islamic history involving Afghanistan. Most significantly, though, is the founder of the Mughal Empire, Babur. And Babur made his name in Kabul, in and around Kabul, where he essentially fell in love with the very diverse climate around Kabul and did a lot of, spent a lot of time there and did a lot of work, particularly with gardens and irrigation canals. This is one of the most famous types of Islamic gardens, the Chahar Bagh, that he developed in and around his own grave, actually. Babur is buried in Kabul. And I just want to emphasize that his memoirs, Babur Nama, contain such a tremendous variety of information about the rivers of Afghanistan, about rafting, irrigation canals, fish, riparian environments, trees, plants. And the Babur Nama has been illuminated with a lot of drawings that give us a sense of how wonderfully attentive Babur was to the water channels and water in Afghanistan. Moving to the colonial era as an imperial formation, it's important to note that the British were lured to Afghanistan by the Indus River, and early mapping here of the Indus River on the left occurs in the early 19th century. And the British essentially culminated their mapping of Afghanistan with the Oxus River in the late 19th century. The map on the right is a Russian map of the Amu Darya River and its basin. And this is to draw attention to Russian and Soviet involvements as an imperial formation in Afghanistan, as well as the British. It's important to note that the first army of occupation in Afghanistan was called the Army of the Indus, to really highlight how important the Indus was for commercial and strategic reasoning for the British involving Afghanistan. Primarily in South Asia, Afghanistan was not fully colonized, so it was not subject to the intense hydraulic engineering and technologies that the British brought to bear, particularly in the Punjab region of North India, where a whole series of integrated new dams, dikes, canals, settlements, roads, bridges, all for, again, a cash cropping, particularly cotton, that has a great impact for British colonialism. Moving to the national period of Afghanistan's water history, I'd like to draw attention to one dam project began in the 1920s in a province south of Kabul, Logar, where a dam was initiated in the 1920s, the Band-e-Sorkhab. And indeed, my grandfather was the first supervisor of that dam in conjunction with the Germans. And it's in that context that my grandfather met and married my grandmother, and my father will pick up the story of that union insofar as it brings my father's discussion of water in Kabul to bear on this conference. The Americans get involved in the water supply of Afghanistan intensively during the Cold War through the Helmand Valley Development Project, which really is reminiscent of the British colonial activities, the canal colonies of the Punjab. We have a historical comparison here. And similarly, it's not just large dams, these are hydroelectric dams, a series of them built in the southern region of Afghanistan with connecting roads, canals, agricultural settlements, cash cropping, the same kind of approach the British took on a higher, more intense scale. And this was a scientific failure. It led to a hypersalinization of the soil and ultimately resulted in the opium economy in many ways that we see associated with Afghanistan's more contemporary period, traceable to the Helmand Valley project. And again, we get a larger sense of the scale of these industrial projects. I would like very quickly to focus on the Kabul River that is first photographed in the late 19th century by the British in the context of the Second Anglo-Afghan War, basically 1880. is the first photo of the Kabul River I can find for you. But I want to take you through a series of photographs of the Kabul River from the 1970s to today, where we see an increasing sort of transformation from what can be seen on a set of physical properties as a transformation from clean to dirty water. But it's important to note that clean and dirty water are cultural constructs, and it's the cultural conditioning of water, again, that my father will pick up. 1970s, Kabul River flowing and a relatively clean. 1980s, certainly not as flowing, it's a different season here, but still sort of usable for washing and cooking, was never for drinking. 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, and more contemporary. And what we see is a sort of metaphor for Afghanistan more generally concerning pollution, that is air and water pollution over the last, let's say, generation in Afghanistan. Now, to close, I'd like to talk about the post-2001 period with the global war on terror, contextualized by profound climate change effects with sustained droughts and famines connected to deglaciation, which we can see glacier melt from 1917 to 18 here, a devastating effect on the water supply of Afghanistan, climate change induced, which brings, of course, climate change involves both increasing floods and droughts, and Afghanistan has been subject to both increasing floods in the contemporary period and increasing droughts as well. And of course, the post-2001 period is a period of active international warfare, as well as intense international humanitarian activity. And what we see is the international humanitarian actions really contextualized by war, such that the focus on water supplies, damming and irrigation is contextualized by conflict resolution and ultimately sort of positioned by a friend and foe political considerations. It's so important that conflict resolution, water has been sort of instilled in conflict resolution type policymaking in Afghanistan, number one. Number two, the transboundary waters have generated a lot of international activity. In the north, a friendship bridge with Uzbekistan over the Oxus River waters and access and transit across it. In the south here, the what is now the India-Afghanistan Friendship Dam in the west on the Hadi Rud River near Herat. So more problematically though, the impact of war on the water supply and environment of Afghanistan more generally. Afghanistan has been subject to an international military occupation with multiple bases throughout the country, and bases pollute the environment, all kinds of toxins, from gasoline to armaments. And we have this global problem of military bases. In fact, all around the United States, the toxicity around bases military bases are a huge problem for the world. And Afghanistan is a really extreme example of that. Much more consequentially is the impact of depleted uranium in the groundwater from US munitions that have been laced with depleted uranium beginning with the Tora Bora campaign in December 2001, which was an intensive bombing of Eastern Afghanistan that results now in Eastern Afghanistan of widespread animal and human birth defects that are not discussed in the international community because of the profound censorship involved in the global war on terror. And we need to take note as conscious global citizens of the incredible criminal abuse of Afghanistan's environment through things like the mother of all bombs, most recently dropped on Afghanistan, full of depleted uranium in the north, affecting the Kabul River basin and ultimately the Indus River basin. And the bombing of the Karez system in the Helmand province has radiated the Helmand province and its groundwater supplies. And this, I suggest, colleagues, is a call to collective action, particularly for United States citizens whose tax dollars are at work in the radiation of Afghanistan's water supply. And I call upon us all to organize and take collective action for remedying some form of compensation, retribution, reparations for this. Afghanistan's waters are now being radiated, rendering the whole environment uninhabitable in the long term. And that's my gravest concern. And I'll end my presentation with that unfortunate conclusion.
Thank you so much, Professor Hanifi, for that sobering presentation. Last but certainly not least, we have another Professor Hanifi. We go from Professor Hanifi the son to Professor Hanifi the father, and that is Professor Jamil Hanifi. He was born and enculturated in Afghanistan. He is a cultural anthropologist with ethnographic research experience in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and the US. Professor Hanifi holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in political science from Michigan State University and a PhD in anthropology from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Professor Hanifi has taught anthropology at California State University, LA, Northern Illinois University, and MSU. He is currently an adjunct research professor of anthropology at MSU. He has authored several books, numerous chapters and articles in academic journals. Several of his academic and political essays are posted on Zero Anthropology and Khorasan Zamin blogs. And the title of his presentation is An Historical Ethnography of Water in Pre-Industrial Kabul. With that, I'll turn it over to Professor Hanifi. Oh, and you are muted, Professor Hanifi, just so you know. So you'll have to unmute the microphone. If you're on a laptop like me, I know when I move my cursor to the bottom left, I can unmute it. Yeah, it's still muted, Professor Hanifi. I know if I move my cursor to the bottom left, that's where I see the mute option. And you should be able to click on that to unmute it. Oh, there we go. Yes.
Professor Khalil?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Professor Khalil, I am grateful to you and for the sponsors of this conference for arranging this very important discussion about a vital topic, global topic. I also want to thank all the participants in this conference. Every one presentation is full of important information and knowledge about what is happening in the globe, especially in Muslim societies. I am just truly grateful to you. My presentation will essentially deal with kind of a brief or ethnographic overview of Afghanistan, water in Afghanistan during my early enculturation in Afghanistan. That's about a long time ago, mid-30s to about mid-40s, mid-50s, until I came to the United States. One of the main reasons I do this is to offer a framework for comparison of that period of time in Afghanistan to what is happening now. Not only in Afghanistan, but perhaps elsewhere as well. In Afghanistan today, we have a population of 5 million people in Kabul. When I was growing up in Afghanistan in the 30s and 40s, the population of the city was 150,000 people. The country, Kabul, today has more than 100,000 shallow wells from which water is detected, and most of them are getting dry. Very few of these homes have centralized channels for diffusing, for removing waste, body waste, and other kinds of waste. So the waste is just buried locally in every residence of Kabul. So between now and 1930s, the space is almost 80 years. And I mean, the transformations that have taken place are really vitally of interest. And I hope somebody will do this. In my own case, I was born in 1935 in southern province of Afghanistan called Logar. My father was the supervisor of a dam, Surkhab, in that province. He married my mother in that province and moved right after the completion of that dam project in 1937 or so back to Kabul to a very medieval type courtyard house. A courtyard house is really kind of inward looking residential complex. Old Kabul was essentially all the residence halls were based to that model. So for a variety of reasons, the material from which these houses were built were basically mud, wood, and mud brick. As I said, the population of that the time I was born and raised in was about 150,000 people. The area I am referring to is, I wish I had a map of the Kabul, if you will kindly imagine it with me. The area south of the Kabul River, its southern bank, stretching to the foothills of the Sheh Darwaza Mountains and the Balako Mountain, stretching east towards the Bala Hisar Fort. That space is about, I would say, about 5-6 square mile at most. All of it in my days was, it consisted of courtyard homes. There were alleys and walkways throughout the city, none straight and geometrically designed, all crooked and curved. So if one was to say pre-industrial, one will not be that off the mark, that the whole area was a pre-industrial environment. How water was received, let me back up. Before I address water, the area we lived in was very close to the Bala Hisar Fort on the east part. Bala Hisar was a fort that was constructed in the 4th and 5th century by the pre-Islamic rulers of the area. And the elite of that ruling machinery lived in the area that I ended up living. These were all very large courtyard homes. In fact, one of them so large that had become my elementary school, not very far, about less than a mile away. In fact, next door to us was the prison for women at that time. Another house that was prominent was given to, actually 2 other houses that were prominent, were given as rewards or gifts in thank you notes to people who had helped the current regime in capturing Kabul. One of those people was the grandfather of Ashraf Ghani, the current president of Afghanistan. So these were really wealthy residents of Kabul living in a really pre-industrial environment. How water was received and consumed is the main interest of my presentation. Most homes had water wells, and those homes were located away from the slope of the mountains towards the Kabul River. We were we were actually on the slope of the mountain, Palangka mountain. I remember several times attempts were made to dig water was unsuccessful. So we had two options. One was to buy water from vendors of water called saqaws. They would vend it in goatskin containers, and I remember buying it at least once a week for our familial needs, which I will list for you in a minute. Another source was a canal of water that was brought from the river of Kabul about 5-6 miles west of the city, where it was not really exposed to human activity, and it was clean or considered clean. That was brought kind of in the foothill of the mountains to the Balahisar fort. We all had access to that. We could not draw strains from it to our own homes. We would send members of our own family, or in our case, we had a servant family living with us. They would go and bring it in jugs, big jugs, or other forms of containers to help us for food, for drinking, and for cleaning. The construction of our homes was a kind of courtyard arrangement. I wish we had time to deal it, but the outstanding part was, of course, the kitchen, as well as the place where you wash yourself. The cleaning of the body was essentially an Islamic requirement. The pollution of the body was incurred with an Islamic lens through sexual intercourse, through touching dead corpse, or to slaughtering sacrificed animal or chicken and so on. You have to ritually clean yourself with water. For non-religious purposes, the water was necessary to wash your hands before and after consuming food, washing clothes, washing pots and pans, sprinkling some of the flowers and plants that we had in the yard. So the water was very precious. We made, in our house, we made several attempts to dig a well. Since we were on the highest slope of the mountain, it was unsuccessful. A few other houses were just like us, unsuccessful. So we depended on two sources. One from the canal that went to from the Kabul River all the way to Balahisar, the other one from people who vended water. Another source that was kind of really not for water, but for a kind of a preparation for using a formation of water in summer. That was the transfer of snow from the sides of the mountains during winter to a cavity in a lower space for use during summer times. We would look at that from the roof of our house with envy. How nice to see water, snow being picked up, taken out and deposited in this cavity called Barfdan. About early June, mid-June, they would begin vending that snow for a really kind of a dessert-like thing. And it was just the best thing we had. And then there on the western side, there was also Yahdon. Yahdon means a cavity for water. During winter times, the water would be kind of streamed to the bottom of that cavity, allowed to freeze. And then when that was done, another layer was inserted, that freeze. So until the whole thing was a huge, massive chunk of ice. About the size of the Bardon, the snow depository, and there were about the size of a kind of a high school basketball court. Now was the thing, and that was really close to our family, and we had access to it. For other purposes, washing the body for ritual purposes, Islamic ritual purposes, as well as for just sanitation, there were hammams. These are public bathhouses in our neighborhood. There were 2 of them. One, Abdul Hamid, we would go there about every week or 10 days with a fee. And there are 2 kinds of those, one for public general bathing, or you could buy a number, more expensive, to have a private room in which you can wash yourself. This was open to men all the time. For women, these 2 places, as in the rest of Kabul, they were open on Friday. And I remember my women of our home couldn't wait to go to hammam on Fridays. There was a kind of a popular joke that if you talk loudly and audibly, you're told, "Are you in a woman's hammam?" We would all laugh. In fact, we would also kind of sneer at a person who was frequently going to hammam because sexual intercourse required that you clean yourself with water after that experience. Also, women were required to be clean after menstruation. As I said, touching a dead body, killing an animal, that required water. Of course, washing clothes in our home required water. Now, how the body waste was disposed was also something that required water, but it had to just remain very local. There were 2 rooms, one tashnab, that's where people, elders, adults would go and prepare, take ablution, get ready for prayer. Another one was for discharging waste from the body. That was called kanarab. On the top level, you would go there and sit on a cavity and discharge waste of body, urine on a tube that will both go to a place called Khandak. The waste from there, not only our family would deposit it there, the other neighbors will do the same thing. And every week there will be individuals with donkeys loading up the waste, the feces, the sewage, from there and moving it to their farms, using it as a fertilizer in their own farms. So human waste was not allowed to go to waste. It was used for the enrichment of potential food for your body. Related to this was another thing I want to mention, that there were 2 kinds of feces, 2 body waste. One of Muslims, which was considered kind of roughly clean, that you could take it and put it on an agricultural feed. The other one was the feces waste of Hindus. The Hindu population of Afghanistan did not have these people who would come and remove the waste from their alleys. Jokingly, the Hindu streets were called Gulab Kocha, rose alleys. I forget it. So in my very early years, if I can remember them correctly, 3, 4, I would go with my mother and older sister to the hammam with them on Fridays. As I grew up to 5, 6, beyond that, with my older brother or my father to the public bathroom. My last experience with water in Afghanistan was when I was getting ready to go to the Kabul airport. I put on a suit for the first time in my life. I got out of the door, and just a few steps away from our door, I saw a sound of water being dumped towards me, thrown at me, and with a phrase that said, Jai Shema Sabs, that your place will be green. Your place will be always green. And the Pashto version of that was Deta Jai Sheen. So that is my last experience in April 1956 with water. We flew from there to Tehran, lived in a small hotel that first night. And I remember using a water tub for the first time on April 15th, 1956. I couldn't turn it off. So the water, went over the tub to the hallway and down the stairs. And I was quite scolded by the owners of the hotel. That's where I want to stop. And hopefully this, what I presented before you, provides a framework for comparison with not only Afghanistan and conditions in between now and 1935, the several episodes and phases, and with other places that are more modern, industrial, or synthesis of all three. Thank you very much, and I am grateful again to Mr. Khalil for arranging this conference.
Thank you so much, Professor Hanifi. So at this time, we have about 33 minutes for questions. So I'd like to invite, first of all, panelists to ask questions, and also for those who are attendees, feel free to type in your question in the Q&A. If you're on a laptop, if you move your cursor around, you'll see Q&A at the bottom. And if you would prefer to ask a question on video or with audio, please make a request in the Q&A and we'll promote you to panelist. So anyway, let's begin first of all with the panelists. Any questions? Yes, Professor Shah Mahmoud Hanifi.
Yes,
okay.
Mohammed, excuse me if I've interrupted someone.
No, go ahead, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm extremely just grateful for all of the Indonesian papers, particularly with reference to forests, which are very much on my mind. Afghanistan has been deforested as a result of war, which has of course contributed to flooding and climate change, etc. But I'm interested from the Indonesian perspective, the relationship between your local actions regarding forest conservation, use, and management and international organizations, the pressures, the funding, the sort of global power that's brought to bear on local forest managements, and how you negotiate any tensions or perhaps conflicts between international and local forest management. And I'm happy to receive comments from any of our Indonesian panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Among the Indonesian presenters, would anyone like to address this question?
Sorry.
Yes.
Pak Khalil. Okay.
Yes.
I have a question for.
Okay, we'll get to the question, but I just want to make sure we answer Professor Hanifi's question. So would anyone like to answer Professor Hanifi's question?
Okay. My question to Shah Mahmoud. Yes. Pak Shah Mahmoud Hanifi, I'm interested in your presentation, especially about water for irrigation, infrastructure irrigation. My question, is the irrigation system still function? If still function, how are they managed to maintain? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And currently, what we have is a, let me say, a general relationship between traditional irrigation technologies, such as the Carré system, and modern irrigation technologies, cement dams and canals. And essentially, Afghanistan has no sort of uniform no uniformity, period, particularly when it comes to that relationship. And so areas where the international presence is prominent, those modern technologies with cement dams and sort of powered sluices in these dams are more prominent rather than traditional mud irrigation canals, for example. So like with every other thing in Afghanistan, there's a collision between local resources and technologies and labor supplies and the international materials and personalities involved in water management. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. And again, those of you who are attendees, feel free to type something in the chat, in the Q&A, excuse me.
Mohammed, if I may reply to a typed question.
Yes.
Excuse me if I've interrupted.
No, you're fine.
I received a very kind note from Maimunah Hussein. I don't know if everyone can see that or not, but it was really about what to do with this very dire situation with depleted uranium. And if I could voice this question for the group as a whole, I'm very interested to know what others may suggest in terms of pursuing remedies for this problem. I have been working personally. There is indeed an Afghan atomic nuclear sort of regulatory agency that's sanctioned by the international atomic organizations. And that minister is not able to really pursue data collection regarding, for example, birth defects in the east of the country, which are now epidemic. Now, what he is, and that's because of the political pressures on his office, it's the occupation, the military occupation of Afghanistan that prevents him from exposing these kinds of consequences of United States warfare in the country. What he is interested in doing, however, with political support is the Soviet, he can pursue depleted uranium, but with reference to downed Soviet, for example, helicopters, that they used depleted uranium to harden the metal in the undercarriage of helicopters, for example, and he can pursue sort of quantitative analysis of radiation from Soviet military material, but he can't from US bombs. And so what we are facing on the inside of Afghanistan are again, the political pressures of censorship and propaganda in war. The external sort of resources, I find scholarly communities the best source of advocacy. So groups that I've been organized, I try to mention this continually. I know the International Criminal Court has actions in play for Afghanistan that of course bring geopolitics into bear. But I would be interested in learning from any other participants here how they pursue remedies for environmental degradation from the international community for helping me do so in Afghanistan.
Dr. Daghestani?
Yeah, thank you first of all to all of you for today's presentation. I really enjoyed all of them. So to Professor Shah Hanifi, I don't really have an answer, but I just want to state that I do share your concerns, because the similar thing has been happening in respect to Iraq for the last 20, 30 plus years, in all honesty, whereby the depleted uranium has been scattered not only in unpopulated places, but especially in civilian areas as well, which include some of the big cities like the Fallujah and Baghdad and so on and so forth. So, one way probably of going about that issue is reaching out to diaspora, a lot of the doctors and the lawyers and people who actually were living at the time in your case, Afghanistan or Iraq, and establishing some sort of international communities and networks and connections in relation to, as you said, international courts. I know that a lot of those cases with the Iraq example have been voiced officially as well to the international court. So maybe something similar could be established, as far as Afghanistan is concerned as well, or even international collaboration between Iraq, Afghanistan. And the same was actually happening a few decades back in Serbia, to much lesser extent though.
The beginning.
It's similar, yeah, exactly, yeah.
If I could just quickly respond without trying to monopolize anything. It is much easier, there's much more information about depleted uranium in Fallujah, for example, than Afghanistan. As a whole, information seems to seep out of Iraq much easier than Afghanistan. Afghanistan is like an information dead zone when it comes to warfare. And so what I also want to mention is that it's all around the world. It's not just Iraq, Afghanistan, and Serbia. It's all around the world where the depleted uranium has been really devastating. And these military bases, the toxins associated with them, for example, around the United States, there are local sort of community groups that advocate for restitution in that regard. And I'd like to touch base with US environmental activists in this regard, potential to pursue the international collaborations you so helpfully mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Jamil Hanifi.
Yes. The issue of the depleted uranium in Southwest Afghanistan I have first-hand information for people who have served there, the American Armed Forces, that the rate of deformed babies is so high that there is a tendency now not to produce human beings. And there's also significant instances of infanticide. That is, babies that are born and deformed are killed, so they will not become older or in a way burdens on their families. And this is stretched not only in Afghanistan, but also into Balochistan, into Pakistan, southwest of Pakistan. This is an issue that is not going to disappear by simply a dialogue, but somebody, some power needs to step in, that this is a reality. We have to do something about it as a health issue, as well as a moral issue, a political issue, and really an issue that requires universal justice to look at it and talk to the inflictors of this, the people who are responsible for this. The United States cannot run away from this by simply not talking about it. There will be time, hopefully sooner than later. But unless that is done, the people of Afghanistan will never sleep well on this. All of Afghanistan knows about this. Discussing it is a siphon. It is not allowed.
Thank you, Dr. Hanifi. Would anyone like to respond to that? Okay, we do have, oh yes, Jay, Sameh, yes. Oh, you are muted, just so you know.
Yeah, and I just wanted to offer a couple different viewpoints to the issue you're talking about. And maybe these provide examples on the way forward for solutions, but similar efforts in unexploded ordinances in Laos and Vietnam, and maybe you're familiar with that, perhaps offer a way forward. And also with the defoliants in Agent Orange and reparations in Vietnam. And I'm no expert, I don't know the details on how those are being resolved or the methods in which they have made progress, but I do know there is progress in those areas.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Rakib.
Just to thank you for adding the rest of the world also in this, because warfare and environment could itself be a really interesting conference to think about. But what happened, I think, in terms of Agent Orange and some of these other areas in terms of Southeast Asia, is that veterans groups became involved. And this is also the case for depleted uranium. I know that there are veterans, US veterans, this is to say, who have been affected by depleted uranium munitions. So I don't know whether there's an attempt to try to include veterans, but of course they have powerful political voices that could be extremely useful.
Thank you. I do see a question in the Q&A. I feel maybe it may have been addressed because it was typed about 8 minutes ago, 9 minutes ago, but I'll go ahead and read it anyway in case anyone would like to add anything. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Hanifi. You mentioned that military bases pollute the environment. It would be great if you could kindly elaborate on this point. Are there any environmental regulations in place to prevent certain practices that can harm living communities and their environment? I know you've kind of addressed this a little bit, but if you'd like to add anything.
Well, let me say, with reference to Afghanistan, there are no safeguards. The military activity, there is so much that we do not know about military activities in Afghanistan. It's fundamentally an experimental zone for all kinds of new technologies. This sort of pain ray thing that we heard about when President Trump was walking to the church recently, he wanted to deploy pain rays, that stuff's developed in Afghanistan, not to mention the illegal prison networks and those sort of black sites in Bagram, for example. But all kinds of genetic experimentation and biometric identifications, particularly, well, I'll just leave that alone. So the military forces, particularly the United States military forces in Afghanistan, seem to have no legal sort of limit or safeguards. A lot of it is beyond legality. And the use of drones raises all sorts of international legal questions. So within Afghanistan, I don't think there's any limits or safeguards to the kinds of pollution that these bases, large and small. Bagram, north of Kabul, is like a small city. Smaller bases in Eastern Afghanistan can be the size of just a small building. So the scales of these things vary greatly, but they all share almost immunity from any environmental safeguards. With reference to bases in the United States, I don't have enough information, but I think there's a lot of different local pressures and sort of municipal or county laws or state laws that lead to a great deal of variation in how pollution around military bases in the United States is addressed. Again, dealing with population centers. Of course, South Dakota, less populous, and Texas, more populous. I think we hear more about the more populated areas than the less populated areas. So, yeah. I can only respond with that.
Thank you, Professor Hanifi. I do want to encourage you all to check out in the Q&A, Professor Natana de Longbas has several comments and a question at the end. I don't know, Professor de Longbas, if you'd like to, I know you're wearing a mask right now, so maybe it's not so good. Okay. Yes, I'll go ahead and read this out loud. Thank you very much to all panelists for these eye-opening pieces, to Professor Jamil Hanifi for opening our eyes to thinking about the myriad ways in which people use water in all aspects of life, and then thinking about the impact of loss of access to water or inability to access safe water. To Professor Shah Mahmoud for bringing attention to the very long-term impact of depleted uranium that impacts all life forms, not just some of them, and particularly children, our future. The photos of the drying and pollution of the river over the decades were particularly evocative. To Ibu Siti for being the change we want to see, by recognizing the interconnections between human existence and all life forms and calling for attention to that integrated approach. To all of our Indonesian colleagues for teaching us about the incredibly rich and biodiverse environment of Indonesia. My question is, how can we best support each other's work? How can we be like water, moving where we need to be without being stopped by human barrier? So I'll pose that question, and I wonder if anyone would like to take this on or to begin that conversation. Professor Jamil Hanifi.
Yes, sir. Professor Khalil, that is a very, very important invitation. I would like to invite scholars and the elite of all these countries, especially Afghanistan, to kind of really take a critical look as to what is happening to the environment. Take Kabul, for example, its population of 5 million compared to 150, 80 years ago. What is if somebody look at the realities, the whole there was a mountain, the Palangka mountain, and all the hills around are packed with courtyard homes. No water, no central way to remove waste. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands. What is the future of this like? What is it going to look like 20 years from now? Its health consequences, its environmental consequences. Somebody needs to step in and say that, or raise the question that we need to become critical of this. So we need to become informed and do something about it. If not for ourselves, but for the future, for the people who are going to be replacing us in the next 30, 40, 50 years. We are responsible to pass on something clean and healthy, and not create for them dump yards in which they can step in and suffer and die. Perhaps the international agencies, other institutions that are interested, academic, otherwise, to really, vividly, to seriously step into this. And this will probably make more sense for those who know Afghanistan now. A population from 150 to 5 million in almost the same space is not just a joke. It's a terrific, terrible, challenging transformation. Let us take it seriously. I've listened to some of the colleagues here. I mean, I can see the capacity in them to address this successfully. The elites in the political environment in Kabul and the international circle that provides the umbrella for them do not want to. They don't want to. They can't. If they did, they will have to give up what we have, their power, to somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hanifi. Would others like to respond? Yes, Dr. Dagestani.
So that's just a very brief suggestion in relation to Professor Delongbas's question. Academically speaking, I think one way of supporting our work is to continue having these kind of discussions, whether in a form of a seminar or a webinar or a conference, and also thinking of an academic output, which is journals or publishing work or publishing edited volumes. Again, this is strictly academically speaking, but I think it's important, number one, for us to understand where do we come from, coming from very different disciplinary backgrounds, and number two, how to find different paths and vistas for future work and understanding. Because at the end of the day, I think all those different sciences and approaches are valuable. The thing is how to kind of merge them together for a better tomorrow, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dagestani. Would others like to comment? Yes, Professor Rakib.
So, yeah, and thank you for that, to think about what we in the academy should be doing in terms of our own academic expertise. It strikes me that, especially listening to Dr. Hanifi's presentation, Dr. Hanifi Sr., the importance of remembering the past, the importance of just simply keeping track and recording the way that things were and these alternative ways of life in these places. Because I think one of the most important things we can pass on to the next generation is the ways that people have lived in these spaces that are quite different from what they see. There is a tendency to presume that the way things are now are the way things must always be. So although it's a kind of a sad, maybe even depressing prospect, it's tremendously important that we perform this function of recording and memorializing what is being lost through these activities.
Thank you, Professor Braco. Would others like to comment or ask questions? Yes, Professor Shah.
Just some preliminary thoughts. I haven't really developed a thought in my head, but I just wanted to say something. You know, from yesterday, the discussion that we had around categorizations even. So when we talk about the West or the Muslim world, we create this dichotomy between these two worlds, and we make some people within that, you know, that mass invisible. For example, if I take the example of Pakistan, and if I call it a Muslim country, I am making all the other religious entities within that country invisible. And similarly, when we talk about West, we make ourselves invisible as Muslims, as Jews, as Hindus. And I think bringing out that visibility in the language and bringing out the nuances, I think is also helpful.
Thank you so much. Yes, Professor Lauren Baker, or Lauren Baker. Yeah.
Sure. I'm also curious. I know that not all of us are. We have very different sort of backgrounds and institutional responsibilities, but I'm curious how many among us have teaching responsibilities, because that seems like an important part. So like I teach, I think several other people, I don't know if we can, yeah. Okay, so it seems like a fair number of us teach. And so it seems like, in addition to, some people have mentioned the role of advocacy within the institutions that we're in. Like a lot of us are in institutions that actually have a lot of power as universities, as was mentioned in several groups yesterday. So whether that's asking, you know, pressuring our institutions, especially those of us who are tenured, that's not me, but have more institutional power to pressure those institutions to make changes in terms of how they relate to the environment. But I think also in terms of our own teaching, bringing in these conversations about the interconnectedness of environment and politics, and really encouraging our students to think critically about, you know, these, what otherwise might be considered like externalities of war or economy. So I think that whether you're in an economics or political science or religious studies or history course, you can bring in these, you know, incredibly rich pieces of the puzzle that students might not have thought about otherwise, because of the censorship that Professor Hanifi was so, you know, importantly focused us on. So I think teaching is just, and whether that means bringing each other into like guest lecture, or making sure that our syllabi are not white, I think is really important. So yeah, so that's sort of a maybe institutional and also our own individual teaching efforts.
Thank you so much. I see Professor Shah Mahmoud Hanifi, and also then Professor Jamil Hanifi. Professor Jamil.
Father.
Yes, Professor Jamil Hanifi, yes. Oh, but it is muted now, Professor Hanifi, Jamil Hanifi. Yeah, so on the bottom left, there should be the mute.
I cannot help but to share with you just a slice of my memory. In 1959, I was a member of what was called the Afghanistan Studies Association in the United States. In our annual meeting at the University of Minnesota, we were received by the vice president of the university, who had just returned from Afghanistan. He opened by saying, I have never seen a sky more blue and stars so shiny anywhere in the world. I have heard today that you can hardly see a star in Kabul. You can hardly see blueness in the sky. It's all covered by whatever human beings generate on Earth, whether it's an automobile or something else. I thought I'd just share that thought with you. Now, maybe we all go through this fate. I think I don't know what the United States was like 50 years ago, 100 years ago. We ought to become very aware that our impact on this globe is not just a casual thing. We're ruining this place. We ought to become very aware, whether it's Afghanistan or Chicago or right here in Lansing. Thank you.
Thank you. And by the way, in the Q&A, there's a rich discussion here going on, and there's some great suggestions by Pak Atus and Ibu Siti, Maimunah. So please look at the Q&A when you get a chance. And then Professor Shah Mahmoud, Hanifi.
Again, thank you. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat as well. Just echoing my father, the air pollution is so thick in Kabul, you can wake up with a nice bath. By the end of the day, you're scraping off dirt. It's just unbelievable, the air pollution, the water pollution. But my general comment involves the strand of conversation that had to do with academic communication between ourselves, using organizations, with our students, and sort of academic solidarities. And those are, of course, a source of, great power. However, what I'm interested in is local knowledge and people in Afghanistan, people in Indonesia. It's a kind of different community of intellectual production. And everyone in Afghanistan knows that Afghanistan, Kabul in particular, is running out of water. Everyone knows it's not a sustainable environment. Now, how to translate that knowledge into local academic or political action is quite another matter, but I suggest that it's really in the local context that the actions are most relevant. So I'm interested in learning from our Indonesian colleagues, for example, what sort of things do they do to educate children in Indonesia about forest ecologies? Is there a forest curriculum in the Indonesian school system? Because let me just say something about Afghanistan. In the first instance, Afghanistan should not be understood through Kabul. We're making a big mistake by reducing Afghanistan to Kabul. Whenever we do that, it's an error. Secondly, the sorts of social, cultural, and political conflicts in Afghanistan, whether they're organized by ethnicity, class, or region, can be surmounted with collective environmental consciousness. So what I see is a real important political opportunity for environmental consciousness to transcend the ethnic, political, class divisions of the country. So it really becomes a matter of national reconstitution, environmental knowledge, and concern about the environment, awareness of mountain ecologies, desert ecologies, is a pathway to building a sense of collectivity that has not existed in Afghanistan. So I'd like to learn from others about strategies to bring environmental consciousness to local, to local effect.
Thank you, Professor Hanifi. So it is, I wonder if anyone would like to respond. I will say that, it strikes me that there is great potential for our respective institutions to work together. We all represent an institution. And I think that there is, if we put our heads together, I'm sure we can think of ways that we can collaborate beyond this conference. I think that would be a great idea if we can continue the conversation. It is 11:25, so that marks the official end of the fourth panel. We will now open the floor for 20 minutes for a general discussion to discuss the conference as a whole. And at the end, I do want to save a couple of minutes to talk about possibly publishing the number of the papers. So just to recap, yesterday we had two panels. The first was on Islam and environmental activism. We had Professor DeLong Bess talking about interfaith, interscriptural readings and interfaith cooperation. Dr. Abdul Majid Qatranji, who could not be here today, spoke about the Quran and how it relates to this topic of environmental ethics. Professor Sarah Talili discussed the ecology of wonder. Dr. Sami al-Daghestani looked at Islamic sources on environmental issues, looking at various classical Islamic perspectives. Then Professor Jonathan Brockup discussed the issue of climate change in the Muslim world. Professor Gretel Van Wieren looked at religion and food for a hot planet. Then Lauren Baker looked at the environmental political action in North Africa. And then Qudsiya Shah looked at Muslim approaches to the environment and sort of reassessing those approaches. So that was yesterday. Of course, today we just had today, so I'm not going to go through everything we went through today. So let's open the floor for maybe unresolved issues, quite open questions that were not addressed, or perhaps even comments. So I open the floor to you all. Let me turn on gallery view so I can see. So let's begin with Qudsiya.
There was a comment that I just wanted to share with Lauren. When I started thinking about climate change and I became aware about this, the first thing I looked at was, I speak 3 languages. So what was the word for garbage in the languages that I spoke or I knew about? So I found it very interesting that your research was around that, around waste. And I don't know if in Morocco, if there are any other local languages as well that are spoken, and if you did a similar kind of, explored this as well, this aspect.
I unfortunately don't speak Amazigh, which is the other, but I do speak French and Arabic, and I'm learning the local Darija, the language. But yeah, you're right. This is, I think I mentioned, it was a preliminary trip, so it was hopefully laying the foundation for future research. But language is really, really interesting, and I'm glad you raised that, because even the way that words themselves are used, I read a really interesting book by a woman working on environmental preservation efforts in the Yemeni island of Socotra, and people there talk about the arrival of the environment, meaning the arrival of the teaching the environment as like a preservation, and teaching as the location became a site that people traveled to. And then we have other situations in which means something very different, means something more akin to just like situation or context. So thank you for raising that, and it's definitely an area that I'm going to be investigating more.
Thank you. Mary, I'd like to ask that you unpin the video, and actually if we could do a gallery view, that would be ideal. Thank you in advance. I actually have a question myself, and I don't know if I should present this to Pak Karyanti or Pak Siti, but the question is, Pak Karyanti, Ibu Karyanti, in your presentation, you mentioned the inspiring example of Ibu Siti. And I wonder if you could tell us about what you're seeing, as far as more and more women going into this kind of this activism to save forests. I wonder, what are you seeing? Ibu Karyanti, yes.
Yes. Yeah, I see Mrs. Maimunah, this is woman inspiration. Me and woman in Kalimantan. Siti Maimunah, this is perfect girl in conservation in forest. This is.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. I think Jay wants to say something. Yes.
Let me unmute first. Yeah, so I've had the pleasure of working with Siti Maimunah and seeing her in her academic environment at previously at Muhammadiyah University in Palangka, Raya. And my observations were she had numerous female students that were in her courses, that were going to Mangkubaru with her to conduct field work, to conduct community engagement. And that's my only data point, but I thought it was a very good marker in order to see that there are many females at the junior level, but also others throughout the university, female staff throughout the university that held her in high esteem. Even if they weren't foresters, were following what she was doing out of things like the Islamic Studies group. And the collaboration that actually developed as an impetus for this conference through the collaboration with from Ibu Siti in forestry with the Islamic Studies Center at her university.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Jay. I appreciate that. Okay, who would like to speak next? Yes, Dr. Al-Darastani.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up, and this is to our Indonesian contingent, but also maybe Professor Samek can partly answer if he knows, what's happening on the ground. But I was wondering, to what extent is Muslim teaching subordinate to environmental programs happening, let's say, at the Muhammadiyah organization, and to what extent are, let's say, institutional or international powers invested in these initiatives and programs, if at all? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to respond to that?
Ibu Siti, do you want to try to answer that?
Oh, you're unmuted, Ibu Siti. It is muted right now.
Maybe she cannot hear us.
Oh, okay. She can't hear us. Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Maybe in the Q&A, Sam, if you could type the question in the Q&A. Yep. Yep. Other questions or comments?
Please say a few words if you
please.
Want. But it's an area that I'm also trying to understand more clearly. But I've always heard Ibu Siti describe the Muhammadiyah group and their flavor of Islam as scientific Islam. So ones that don't have any adverse viewpoints towards a scientific basis for forest ecology or other environmental concerns. Which one is, where the preference lies in the environmentalism versus Islamic teaching is something I'm not familiar with, but that slide presentation that Pak Gatot presented, I feel gives me some insight into that to some degree. But again, it would be more enlightening to have someone from the organization, and maybe as a follow-up question or email to Ibu Siti or others regarding that.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Who else would like to ask a question or make a, yes, Professor Chalivi.
It's not a question, it's just, I was interested in, like you, Professor Samek, you raised very important questions or topics of discussion this morning before we started the panels. And I would like to go back to that if, I don't know, like if anyone, I mean, I'm quite interested also in the material that was presented today. So if this is the direction that everyone would like to pursue, that should be fine.
Well, it's an open discussion, so it's perfectly fine. Yeah.
All right. So here, I mean, I would like to comment on what you've said this morning about the role of science in general, you know, like especially, you know, like its role and its relevance to environmental issues. I'm quite grateful for Dr. Shah for reminding us yesterday and today as well that we should never paint everything with with one brush, of course. And I keep reminding my students and myself all the time of the complexity of issues and the nuances. This is always important to highlight. So you asked this morning whether, you know, like there is good science versus maybe not so good science, and the distinction between practice and theory. And all of this is, of course, quite important. Nonetheless, I mean, I acknowledge this, and I cannot emphasize it enough myself, you know, like it's not, but there is a culture, I think, in the scientific world that is also recognizable. There are trends that are, Lynn White in his very, I'm sure like many of us are familiar with the seminal article of Lynn White, which was written in the 60s, and it's still discussed up until today. He, you know, like he has issues with the alliance that emerged in modern culture between science and technology, right? So there is science as the science that allows us to understand the world and everything, you know, around us. And this is something that I believe, you know, like all of us, I don't know, like love this dimension of science. It's just like so much mind broadening. It allows you to understand, to appreciate, to kind of savor the world around us. But there is also, you know, like Lynn White says that in pre-modern times, technology was looked upon as something inferior. Scientists would not engage in technology. You know, like technology is for craftsmen. It's not for the people who have, you know, who pursue like, you know, kind of intellectual endeavors. And that's an oversimplification, of course. You know, I think knowledge has always been involved in developing technology, but for them to become such allied powers in the modern period, I think there's a huge responsibility for what we have in the environment today. And I believe that the presentations that were given today, you know, about, I don't know, like even the war technology, all of this, you know, what, like, we wouldn't have had like such sophisticated weapons that could cause such tremendous damage to the environment if it were not for this alliance between science and technology that is that has developed today. So this is something, I mean, when I say this, it's not like because I want to condemn science or to say that it is bad for us today, right? It is, however, to draw attention to certain features of scientific knowledge and epistemology that is predominant today, which needs to be acknowledged. You know, science believes, in fact, you know, like many people in the field of ethology, which is a field of science, you know, like that tries to understand the animal mind, they are very critical of science because it tends to, there is this tendency to treat, you know, absence of evidence as evidence of absence. If we cannot know what is in the mind of an animal, then it means the animal does not have a mind, right? There is this modesty that is perhaps sometimes absent, culturally speaking. I'm not saying, you know, culturally speaking, in the world of science, there is this absence of modesty. There is this like excessive faith in the ability of the human mind and the human reason to solve everything, to the extent that it tends to ignore other dimensions. You know, it tends to ignore effect and the other modes of knowledge that we humans are equipped with, right? So it's not like to, again, like to undermine science or to kind of not acknowledge what science has done to humanity in the modern age, it is nonetheless to bring attention to this culture, like that is rather predominant, like it dominates the scientific field in the modern era, in the modern age. And it is something that we need to acknowledge if we want to build better science. The problem, I believe, is there. It's not just the imagination of some scholars. So that's what I wanted to say in reaction to what you've said this morning.
Thank you, Professor Talili. Maybe Professor Skoll, I'll let you maybe sort of respond during the closing remarks, because I do want to sneak in a quick question here that came up in the Q&A that I think is very relevant. This is from Amira Qureshi. Your presentations have been very illuminating. Thank you. I work with college students as their Muslim chaplain. Do any of you have advice for dealing with feelings of fear and despair in the face of climate change? Who would like to respond to this?
I can say something about it. First of all, Amira and I went to UPenn together. Hello, it's such a pleasure to have you among us today. Like, it's wow. It's like today's presentations were quite depressing for probably all of us. We will not be able to sleep well tonight. And I've been like in this field for a while now, and when I read about what is happening to animals, it is very, very depressing. I try actually to find my balance in spirituality, and whenever I recite the Quran, or I go back to the faith dimension, and I feel like it's not about changing the world. Actually, I don't want to change the world. I want just to do the right thing. It's always about doing the right thing. And I think once we, I don't know, I'm sharing this with you, Amira, and with your students, doing the right thing brings so much peace, and it is the two notions of taslim and tawakkul, taslim, putting things in God's hands. I'll do my share, and I know very well that I cannot change the world, but I know that God is very, very merciful, and when he sees enough of us doing the right thing, I think he will put barakah and he will help. So it is I don't know, I don't think we have the energy. It can be very depressing if we start thinking that we can change the world, because we cannot change the world. If we just change ourselves to become better people, that is, and to have the right attitude, to strive, actually, not even to do the right thing all the time, but to strive toward that, it does bring peace, and it does help, I think. So that's how I deal with it. I don't know if it can help others or not. But
I do others think I do, and I also apologize for mispronouncing Amira's first name. But other responses to this, Professor Brakup?
Yeah, and thank you for that. So just to build on what Professor Tilly said, think globally and act locally. So the doing that we have to do is local, and I think that's tremendously empowering. In my work with students, taking a small project, for instance, we have an area of parkland here that's all overgrown with non-native species, and they get in there and to start transforming that back with native species can be very empowering, that process. And then the second thing is to not be alone, to work in community. And whether that's study of Quran, whether it is going on a hike in the local environment or forest, wherever you are, joining with other people who are working together, that itself helps to prevent that sort of a sense of depression. And may I say, working outside in terms of the world of COVID-19 also is a great thing to do. Thank you, Professor Brakup. Well, it is now 11:45, so we've completed nearly 8 hours of Zoom meetings. So first of all, I want to thank you all. This has been incredible. This has been a great conversation. It's now time for closing remarks.
So I want to turn to my two colleagues who have been my partners in crime, along with Mary Ferdowsi and Siddharth Chandra, in putting this together. Let me introduce them formally now. They are first Professor David Skoll. Professor Skoll is Professor of Forestry. His research focuses on the relationship between land use, change, climate change, and the use of geographical information for sustainable development and natural resource management. The current focus of his work is climate change mitigation and adaptation in international development, with a focus on carbon measurement, and I'm going to probably mispronounce this, and accounting for REDD plus or REDD positive or plus, something like that?
Yes.
Plus. He has more than 25 years of experience with research on forestry and carbon. He was instrumental in constructing the first numerical carbon accounting model and has been spearheading the integration of satellite remote sensing into carbon accounting models. He was formally recognized for his climate change research as an official member of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He is now active in the emerging carbon financial markets and applications of his research to carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation projects in developing countries. And the other, my other colleague is, of course, Jay Semek. Jay Semek is a human geographer by academic training with degrees from Dartmouth College and Michigan State University. He has worked with Dr. David Skoll in the Department of Forestry at MSU as a senior research scientist for more than 20 years. His work centers on human-environment interactions across social and biophysical disciplines that include spatial scales from community-level agroforestry to global-level climate change science. And I'll turn it over to them.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed, for that introduction. Let me begin, not as I planned, but a little bit in response to the earlier comments that I thought were really well spoken, Professor Tilili. I agree with what you're saying. And in fact, I too am old enough to have studied some of the, well, Lynn White's great piece on the history of our current ecological crisis. But also I'm reminded of Thomas Kuhn's very famous treatise on the structure of scientific paradigms, which articulated that many new thoughts and paradigms in science don't derive from the eureka moment as much as from who's funding it or what the political and economic priorities of the day are trending. Similarly, you know, of course, we all know Snow's two cultures, you know, between the humanities on the one hand, and the science as two ways of doing business in the search of understanding. And so, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think we have to recognize that that science is often driven by a lot of forces, including some that are maybe not so benign, perhaps. But I'm also reminded that Kuhn and White and Snow were talking about a time coming off of World War II and the atomic age. And there was a kind of a perspective at that time that might not have been the same as what followed after the 60s and the ecological movement, the environmental movement of the 1970s. And so I do think that the cadre of scientists in place now, what I was saying is not about good science versus bad science, although there's plenty of bad science being discussed these days. That's not really what I was saying. I was more referring to, you know, over time, the great scientists that I have seen and I've admired all have been driven by a higher kind of calling to understand the natural world and understand its beauty, its complexity, diversity, and especially ecologists like myself. And I think that many scientists of the great ones that I've known, as we all have, are driven by certainly by proclivities to do analytical work because that's what they're good at, but by this kind of higher approach. And so there's a lot of work to do, and I agree with all the comments you're making. I think that's a great topic for future discussion. I wish I could say more than that. The other comment I would make very quickly is that I've made an observation, and I'm very naive here. I'm not in this field, so forgive me if I'm terribly naive and wrong about this. But it seems to me that there's this tension that came up in the discussions, a natural tension between looking at these kind of issues at the scale of the individual and the individual's behavior with respect to the natural world, and the role and from the perspective of institutions and how institutions respond to environmental issues and the natural world. And I've been struck, or I'm thinking in my own mind about how the religious scriptures and religious teachings, perhaps I could be wrong, but perhaps emphasize a lot about individual behaviors and how the individual can be good in light of certain scriptures, standards, teachings, principles, and so forth. Now, that makes me reflect on something that happened, and also going back to Dr. Brockup's remarks about the efforts at Penn State University to be more green in energy and climate change mitigation. We too at MSU did that, and I was centrally involved in that. And what we did was we took a look at our power plant and our electricity consumption and the greenhouse gas emissions that come from that. And what we found was that the greenhouse gas emissions from our power plant alone, for our endeavor here on campus, our endeavors, were greater than the entire emissions from Liberia and Sierra Leone in West Africa, those two countries. And so the impact of this university here, and all the good that we do, and we do good, not just in sports, I think for other things too, is still having this impact on the global environment. And so we said we needed to reduce our emissions, and we did a lot of studies, and we did a lot of projects. Some of them were like, turn off the lights. This was about individual behavior. Others, though, were we have to move off of coal. We have to change our whole perspective at the institutional level. And it turned out that really the big impacts were moving away from coal, not turning off the lights by individuals. And it looked like really institutional change had the most immediate and profound impact than cultural change or individual change. And so it speaks to me as to, and let me be clear, there's nothing wrong with individual behaviors. We have to do that. And collectively, our behaviors as consumers probably has to change. But it struck me that the things that we were talking about in terms of the relationship between Islam and the environment could be thought about at both levels. And I just wondered how it would be approached at the institutional level. And I'm sure there are ways we can discuss that. And so that would be something I could see as something going forward, the contrast of the individual action versus, or perhaps local action versus institutional action and global action or international action. So with that, let me just wrap up and say very few last words, just very quickly. First of all, thank you very much, Mohammed and Mary, and to everybody on your team in the Muslim Studies program. When we hatched this idea together a year ago, we didn't think it would happen necessarily, but I'm glad it did, and largely because of your efforts in the Muslim Studies program. But also thank you to the Asia Studies Center for their support with Siddharth and his team, the Dean's Office at the International Studies and Programs here at Michigan State University for their support. I tell you, this series of presentations certainly opened my eyes to some new ideas, and I thank all the presenters for all the very interesting presentations that you delivered in the last 2 days. Thank you very much for that. From my own perspective in my work, I see the emerging global scale and character of so many of our important societal concerns today, whether from economic globalization to global pandemics to global climate change itself and others. And the social context of these global problems is very important, especially important to finding solutions, because the context for this is as diverse and varied as the environment itself. And I think we certainly must strive to find knowledge and understanding of the range of possibilities that are before us and the diversity of possibilities that comes with the diversity of perspectives, cultures, and viewpoints. And so, you know, whether by Zoom or in person, I think we need more opportunities like this one, as someone earlier said, to get together and share our perspectives and learn from each other like this. So again, you know, thank you to everyone, and go forward, stay safe and healthy and well, and thank you.
Professor School, and I'll turn it over to Jay.
Thank you, Mohammed. Yes, I want to echo the thanks that Dr. Scholl just laid out to everybody. That Mohammed, I really appreciate the hard work you've done to make this happen, to move from a in-person conference to the online format, and to thank all the presenters, especially my colleagues in Indonesia, who transitioned from having, unfortunately, not able to be here in person to presenting late at night in Indonesia through Zoom. The past 2 days have been fantastic for me. I've been able to be a student completely, which is something I don't often get to do for 2 straight days. And it's been encouraging and enlightening in many ways. And while I'm distressed as to what I've learned about Afghanistan, in part because I know the story of UXOs and unexploded ordnances and defoliants in Laos, which is the country where my wife comes from. So I'm very much impassioned by what you're struggling with in your work in Afghanistan. I'm equally enlightened, though, by the work of Muhammadiyah organization in Indonesia and the efforts that comprehensive organization throughout Indonesia, from secondary school education up through college teaching, is moving in a direction of environmental sustainability. And to see the work that Siti has done as an embodiment of the Muhammadiyah organization is very encouraging to me and enlightening. So I have many reflections on it throughout the past few days. As a student, I've been trying to figure out how this would, how what I've learned can inform my own work. And as you know from the introduction from Dr. Scholl and in his discussion, we do a lot of work in the area of climate change, carbon, and forests. But I also do a lot of work within the lab structure and within our own focused research on community forestry. And part of that engagement includes working to do measurement and monitoring of ecosystem services, carbon being an ecosystem service. If we think about the 4 components of ecosystem services: provisioning services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural services, we do a lot of our work in the regulating service of climate change, trying to measure carbon and influence in a positive way the rehabilitation of forests and the reduction of deforestation and forest degradation. Working with Siti, we also work in the community forest area in terms of provisioning services and non-timber forest products and the like. What we don't do enough of in our work at the community level is the areas of cultural services. So that's a piece that I'm challenging myself to work more completely on in my engagement with communities wherever I'm working. And I'm lucky enough to be starting a project in Aceh, Indonesia, that will be doing some training on ecosystem service measurement and monitoring with community forestry people and local level forest officers. So it gives me a chance now to think about actually bringing into this piece the concepts of religion and culture in terms of understanding the forest resource in those aspects. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And again, thank you to everybody. And I hope we are able to continue discussions and perhaps do this again.
Thank you so much, Jay. Before we conclude, I do want to make sure we get in a word about publications. There is, Dr. Samuel Dagestani is actually editing a volume. And so maybe Dr. Dagestani, if you'd like to say a word about that.
Yeah, sure. Maybe just a brief word. So, but before moving forward, I have to say a word or two on the previous conference because it tied into that, right? So the idea for publication came with our discussion with Professor Khalil and the organizers, how to kind of join forces and bring together into conversation papers from this particular conference and the one that took place last year at RCPL, Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life at Columbia University, where I was still affiliated with. Now, the last year conference focused on religion, environment, and economic traditions. Basically, where we're looking into economic and environmental theories on ethics and on the notion of recovery. And we see that actually a lot of the papers do, to an extent, communicate with one another or overlap. And instead of having like two different set of special issues or edited volumes, if you will, we said, why not join forces and try to see if the papers could be combined. So we're here now. Obviously, we're going to be in touch with you, but maybe just as a show of hands at this particular moment, how many of you would be potentially interested in publishing a paper? Can I just see like a raise of hands? Okay, 1, 2, 3, somewhere in between, 4. Okay, so we do 5. So we do have a handful of paper. Okay, I mean that's a healthy amount to work with, because we already have solicited approximately 6-7 papers from the previous conference. The issue is that we want to have a volume that really focuses on Islamic studies broadly speaking, right? Whereby the idea with the previous conference was to include other religious traditions. So what I would propose is just that maybe you to be a little bit patient, and I would have a word with Professor Khalil and the organizers how to best move forward. But what I can tell you at this point is that we've kind of secured the option of publishing the papers either in a journal or an edited volume at Brill with Islamic Studies. They have the Islamic Studies series or the Journal for Islamic Ethics. So one of the two, and the editors are extremely interested in putting all the papers together and publishing it with Brill at Leiden. So I think best is if we keep in touch, and soon after the conference or the workshop, we're gonna send you an email around with specific technicalities and so forth.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Dagestani. And thank you so much to all of you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for spending 8 hours with us. We owe you dinner times like 5 dinners or 10 dinners or something. I don't know what we owe you, but we owe you a lot. So thank you so much. It was great seeing you all. Thank you to our Indonesian scholars who are, it's late at night in Indonesia. So thank you for being with us on a Friday night. So, and many thanks to you all. Thanks to the Professor School, Jay Semek, everybody, Mary, thank you so much. Have a wonderful life. Hopefully we'll see you around.
Mohammed, you could send